Hello, I'm Peter Whittle. Now, you might be aware that the BBC has been celebrating its 100th anniversary this past few months. What is undoubtedly an occasion for much backslapping throughout the corporation, especially since its much praised coverage of the late Queen's funeral, will not be a cause of joyful celebration to those of us who are demoralised and increasingly exasperated by its undisguised political and cultural bias. The new Director General, Tim Davies, had supposedly made it a priority to confront the growing disquiet over the obvious and overt bias which now runs through the BBC. Well, so far so bad. There appears to be no change. If anything, the situation has deteriorated. Just this week, there were calls for a public inquiry into the reporting by the BBC of an incident in central London in which Jewish students on a bus were subjected to anti-Semitic abuse by a group of young Muslim men. The broadcaster had reported that the men were responding to a racial slur, a charge which is hotly contested, yet which was essentially allowed to stand by the BBC. This follows a number of examples of unquestionable bias where the BBC has found it nigh on impossible to hide its political worldview. Last month, the presenter Maxine Croxall introduced a discussion on Boris Johnson's withdrawal from the Tory leadership race by saying, quote, "Well, this is all very exciting, isn't it? Am I allowed to be this gleeful? Well, I am." Extraordinary, even by the standards of the BBC. This little display simply illustrated the culture in which Miss Croxall works. Such sentiments and anti-Tory bias are so embedded she probably felt emboldened, possibly feeling that there would be no consequences. Then there was the reporting of the election victory in Italy of Giorgia Meloni. Now, the BBC's Europe editor, Katya Adler, told us, quote, "Millions of Italians didn't vote for her. They say they do not recognise themselves in her nationalist, protectionist proposals, her anti-immigration rhetoric, and her conservative family mores," unquote. Now, this was something which, of course, did not need saying, unless it was to convey Katya Adler's contempt for Meloni's politics, a contempt no doubt shared by her colleagues at the BBC. Now, whether or not you agree with such sentiments is really beside the point. The BBC is meant to be impartial. It shouldn't be devoting whole sections of its output to, for example, trashing Brexit, as it did very recently during its On the Week programme with Ross Atkins, an item which has now been reported to Ofcom. It's extraordinary then that after 100 years such a statement about the requirement of impartiality needs to be made. And also, what these displays of bias show is that, like all bloated public bureaucracies, the BBC is incapable of reforming itself. The fact is, it will not change. Yet again, this is an issue on which Conservative governments have made sympathetic noises only to back off from any meaningful action. Supporters of the BBC say, well, you don't have to watch. Well, increasingly, many people are indeed turning off. Yet it's still a criminal offence not to pay the licence fee if you have a TV. This cannot continue. The licence fee must be abolished. We can no longer tolerate a situation where we have to pay to be subjected to its left liberal worldview. If it wants to survive, the BBC will have to model itself along radically different lines. Far from being the unifying force it perhaps once was, it is now more destructive than beneficial. Thank you. you.